a broken sprinkler, a quiet driveway, a respected federal judge standing in old sweatpants with wet grass under his shoes. That was all anyone should have seen on that soft Saturday morning in one of Atlanta's most beautiful suburbs. But Officer Travis Blake did not see a homeowner. He did not see a father fixing something before breakfast. He saw a black man outside a house he believed was too grand, too clean, and too expensive for him to belong to. In less than an hour, that ugly mistake would turn a peaceful neighborhood into the center of a federal storm, and the man Blake thought he could humiliate in front of his own home would soon be the reason every locked door inside his department began to shake. The morning had begun with the kind of silence Marcus Ellington loved. Not the heavy silence of a courtroom waiting for a verdict, not the sharp silence that fell when lawyers realized they had lost control of a witness, but the gentle quiet of a home still waking up. Sunlight slipped through the tall windows of the Ellington house and stretched across polished floors, family photographs, and a kitchen counter where a half-empty cup of coffee waited beside the Saturday newspaper. Outside, the lawns of Briar Glen Estates rolled smooth and green beneath old oak trees, each yard trimmed like a picture in a magazine. The houses were wide, bright, and expensive, tucked behind stone mailboxes and iron gates, the kind of neighborhood where people noticed everything, but rarely said anything out loud. Marcus was used to being noticed. At 51, he had spent most of his adult life in rooms where every word mattered. He was a federal judge for the Northern District of Georgia, known for his calm voice, careful rulings, and an almost impossible patience that made nervous attorneys lower their tone without being asked. He had presided over fraud trials, civil rights hearings, public corruption cases, and more than one matter that had put his name on national news programs. People in court stood when he entered. Marshals moved when he nodded. Lawyers prepared for weeks just to speak for 15 minutes in front of him. But at home, Marcus liked being ordinary. He liked cutting fruit for his youngest daughter before soccer practice. He liked arguing gently with his wife, Alina, about whether coffee counted as breakfast. He liked old sweatpants, college hoodies, worn sneakers, and the small comfort of doing things with his own hands. The world outside expected robes and gravity from him. His family expected him to take out the trash before the bag got too full. Marcus preferred the second kind of authority. That morning, he had stepped outside because the sprinkler near the driveway had begun coughing water in every direction except the lawn. One broken head had turned the neat front grass into a bright little swamp. Marcus had noticed it while standing in the kitchen, watching water slap against the side of his mailbox in uneven bursts. Alina had laughed from behind her mug and told him to call the landscaping company. Marcus had smiled, pulled on his faded Morehouse hoodie, and said he was still capable of solving one problem without issuing an order from the bench. So there he was, kneeling near the driveway, with a small wrench in one hand, and wet soil darkening the knees of his sweatpants. The air smelled of cut grass and warm pavement. Somewhere behind him, a neighbor's wind chime rang softly. A delivery truck rolled past 2 streets over. The whole morning felt harmless, almost sleepy. Marcus twisted the sprinkler head loose, leaned closer, and frowned as a thin spray of water caught him across the cheek. He wiped his face with his sleeve and chuckled to himself. Then the patrol car appeared. It came slowly around the curve at the end of the street, its black and white paint shining under the clean morning light. Marcus heard the engine before he looked up. In Briar Glen, patrol cars passed through often enough to be familiar. The Homeowners Association paid extra for regular patrols, not because much crime happened there, but because people with large houses liked feeling protected from things they could not name. Marcus had never paid much attention to it. He knew most of the officers who had been assigned to the area over the years. Some waved, some did not. It made no difference to him. This cruiser slowed as it approached his driveway. Behind the wheel sat Officer Travis Blake, 38 years old, shoulders tight beneath his uniform, jaw set as if the world had personally offended him before breakfast. Blake had joined the department 12 years earlier, And in his mind, the job had never given him the respect he deserved. Promotions had passed him by. Commendations had gone to people he considered softer, luckier, or more politically polished. He told himself he was old school, that he knew how to read the street, that everyone else was too scared to do real police work. Around the precinct, people knew him differently. Aggressive, quick to anger, too comfortable putting his hands on people, too certain that his suspicion was the same thing as evidence. In the passenger seat was Officer Nolan Reed, older by nearly 20 years, with tired eyes and the careful posture of a man who had survived by learning when silence was useful and when silence was dangerous. Reed had seen enough bad stops, bad reports, and bad tempers to know the difference between instinct and prejudice. He also knew Blake hated being corrected, especially in front of civilians. So when Blake's eyes narrowed at the sight of Marcus crouched in the grass, Reed felt a small warning bell ring somewhere deep in his chest. Blake eased the cruiser almost to a stop. "What's he doing?" Blake muttered. Reed glanced across the driveway, then toward the house. "Looks like he's fixing a sprinkler." Blake did not answer right away. His gaze traveled over Marcus's hoodie, his old sneakers, the wet sweatpants, then up to the wide stone front of the Ellington home. It was one of the largest houses on the street, all pale brick, tall windows, and a long driveway that curved toward a 3-car garage. In Blake's mind, the story had already written itself. A man who looked like Marcus did not belong outside that house unless he was working for someone, and if he was working for someone, he should have been in a truck with a company logo, not standing near the garage like he owned the place. Marcus looked up as the cruiser stopped at the curb. He expected a quick question, maybe a nod, maybe nothing at all. Instead, Blake stepped out with the heavy confidence of a man who had already decided how the conversation would end. His hand rested near his belt. Reed got out more slowly on the other side, watching. "Hey!" Blake called. "Step away from the house." Marcus blinked, still holding the wrench. Water ticked softly from the broken sprinkler into the grass. "Excuse me." "I said step away from the house. Put that tool down." Marcus looked at the wrench, then back at the officer. His first feeling was not fear. It was confusion, followed by the familiar, weary awareness that confusion often did not last long in moments like this. He placed the wrench gently on the edge of the driveway and stood up. "Officer, this is my home," Marcus said. His voice was calm, almost warm. "I live here." Blake gave a short laugh, the kind without humor in it. "You live here?" "Yes. You got ID?" Marcus glanced toward the front door, only 30 feet away. "My wallet is inside. I came out to fix the sprinkler. You can come with me while I get it, or you can run the address through dispatch. My name is Marcus Ellington." Something flickered across Reed's face when he heard the name, not recognition yet, but the sense that he had heard it somewhere important. Blake missed it completely. He took a step closer. "You don't tell me how to do my job," Blake said. "We've had reports of suspicious people in this neighborhood." Marcus looked around the empty street. Curtains had begun to move in 2 windows across the road. Someone was watching from behind white blinds. "I understand," he said. "But I am standing on my own property. I have offered a simple way to verify that. You're standing outside a multi-million-dollar house with no ID and a tool in your hand," Blake snapped. "That's what I'm seeing." "What you are seeing," Marcus replied gently, "is a homeowner repairing his sprinkler." The calmness bothered Blake more than any shouting would have. He was used to nervous explanations. He was used to anger, fear, and people stumbling over themselves to prove innocence he had no interest in seeing. Marcus did none of that. He spoke like a man who expected reason to matter. To Blake, that sounded like arrogance. Reed came around the front of the cruiser. "Trav, let's just run the address." He gave a name. Blake shot him a hard look. "I've got it." Marcus kept his hands visible at his sides. "Officer Blake, I'm not refusing to cooperate. I'm asking you to verify the information before this becomes something it does not need to become." The name on Blake's uniform had been spoken softly, but it landed like a challenge. His face tightened. He stepped in close enough that Marcus could smell coffee on his breath. "Turn around," Blake said. Marcus did not move. "On what charge?" "Turn around now." "Am I being detained?" Blake grabbed his arm. It happened fast, but Marcus felt every part of it with terrible clarity. The fingers digging into his bicep, the sudden wrench of his shoulder, the rough twist that forced his hand behind his back. His body leaned forward, not from surrender, but from physics, from pain moving through muscle and joint. Reed said Blake's name sharply, but Blake was already reaching for his cuffs. "Do not do this," Marcus said, his voice lower now, still controlled, but colder. "You are making a serious mistake." Blake laughed under his breath. "Everybody says that." The metal closed around Marcus's wrist with a tight click. Then the other. Blake pushed him toward the cruiser. Across the street, a garage door had stopped halfway open. A woman stood frozen beside her recycling bin. Somewhere inside the Ellington house, a phone began ringing. Marcus thought of Alina upstairs, probably folding laundry, unaware that her husband was being handcuffed in their own driveway. Reed stepped closer, his voice quiet but urgent. "Travis, slow down. Let him get his ID. This doesn't feel right." Blake ignored him. "He's trespassing until he proves he isn't. Maybe casing the place. Maybe trying doors. We'll sort it out downtown." Marcus turned his head enough to look at Reed. "Officer Reed, I am asking you to make sure all body camera and dash camera footage from this encounter is preserved." Reed's eyes changed. Not fear exactly, but the first clear shape of alarm. Blake shoved Marcus into the back of the cruiser. "You can ask all you want." The door closed with a dull, final sound. Through the window, Marcus could see his house, the sprinkler still spitting water in nervous little bursts, the wrench lying exactly where he had placed it. His morning had been so simple only minutes before. Coffee, sunlight, a broken sprinkler. Now he sat with his hands locked behind his back, while a man who had not bothered to check a single fact climbed into the front seat and prepared to drag him away from his own home. The ride to the precinct was quiet at first. Blake drove with one hand on the wheel, breathing hard through his nose, as if the arrest had excited him. Reed sat beside him, stiff and silent, occasionally glancing back through the partition. Marcus did not yell. He did not plead. He sat upright, despite the pain in his shoulders, and studied every turn, every street sign, every word spoken into the radio. Blake reported a suspicious trespasser detained in Briar Glen, possibly connected to recent burglary concerns. Marcus listened carefully. He noted the words Blake used, and just as importantly, the words Blake left out. At the station, Blake walked him through the rear entrance like a prize. The precinct was small but busy, filled with ringing phones, tired voices, and the sharp smell of coffee that had been sitting too long. A few officers looked up as Blake entered with Marcus in cuffs. "Found this guy outside one of the big houses in Briar Glen," Blake announced. "No ID, claims he lives there." Behind the desk, Sergeant Whitaker lifted his eyes from a computer screen. He was broad, gray-haired, and heavy around the neck, with a face that had learned to hide concern under boredom. "Name?" Marcus looked at him. "Marcus Ellington. I want my phone call. I also want every recording from Officer Blake's body camera, the patrol vehicle, the station entrance, and the booking area preserved immediately." The room seemed to grow a little quieter. Whitaker studied him for a moment. There was something in Marcus's tone that did not fit the cuffs, the hoodie, or Blake's proud little smile. It was not fear. It was not performance. It was authority, plain and steady, the kind that made people sit straighter before they knew why. Blake scoffed. "He's been talking like that since the driveway." Whitaker frowned. "You check the address?" He had no ID. "That's not what I asked." Blake's expression hardened. "Sarge, I had reasonable suspicion." Marcus turned his head slightly. "No, you had an assumption. There is a difference." For one long second, nobody moved. Then Whitaker looked away first, not because Marcus had lost the moment, but because the sergeant suddenly wanted distance from it. He nodded toward the holding area. "Put him in 3 for now," Whitaker said. "Let him make his call." Blake grabbed Marcus by the arm again, but this time Reed stepped in. "I'll walk him." Blake stared at him. Reed stared back. The silence between them was thin and dangerous. Finally, Blake released Marcus with a shove that was just small enough to pretend it was not one. Reed led Marcus down a short hallway to a holding cell. Before opening it, he lowered his voice. "Sir, is there someone you want called?" Marcus looked at him. "My chief clerk." "A number is in my phone, if Officer Blake has not misplaced it." Reed swallowed. "I'll make sure you get the call." Marcus stepped into the cell. The door closed. He sat on the metal bench, wrists sore, shoulder aching, grass still stuck to one sneaker. Outside, voices blurred through the walls. Somewhere, Blake was laughing too loudly, trying to make the room believe his confidence was real. Marcus rested his back against the cool concrete and closed his eyes. He was not thinking like a frightened man. He was thinking like a judge. Minutes later, his phone call was placed under Whitaker's supervision. Marcus gave his name first, then spoke with the same controlled patience he used from the bench. "Danielle," he said when his chief clerk answered. "Listen carefully. I have been unlawfully arrested by Officer Travis Blake of the local department near my home. I am being held at the precinct. Contact the Marshal Service. Contact the Chief Judge. Then contact the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. Tell them to preserve everything." There was silence on the other end, then a voice that had gone cold with disbelief. "Judge Ellington?" "Yes," Marcus said. "And Danielle, do it now." The call ended. At the booking desk, Sergeant Whitaker had already begun typing Marcus's name into the system. He expected a driver's license record, maybe a property deed, something simple that would make Blake look careless and the department look foolish. What appeared on the screen made his fingers stop moving. A federal profile loaded slowly, official and unmistakable. Marcus Ellington, United States District Judge, Northern District of Georgia. Whitaker stared at the screen as the blood drained from his face. Beside him, Reed leaned closer and saw it too. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Blake walked over with a paper cup of coffee. "What now?" Whitaker turned the monitor toward him. Blake looked once, then again. The smile fell away so completely, it was like someone had wiped it from his face. On the screen was the man he had handcuffed in a driveway, the man he had shoved into the back of a cruiser, the man he had called suspicious because he did not believe a black homeowner belonged in front of his own house. And beneath the official photograph, in clean government lettering, was the title that made the walls of the precinct feel suddenly too close: Federal Judge. The first black SUV arrived less than 15 minutes later, then another, then 3 more. They moved into the precinct lot without sirens, which somehow made them more frightening. Men and women in dark suits stepped out with calm faces and sharp eyes. Federal marshals took positions near the doors. Department of Justice investigators entered with folders, badges, and the quiet confidence of people who did not ask local departments for permission. Inside the holding cell, Marcus heard the station change. The laughter vanished. Chairs scraped. Voices lowered. Footsteps moved faster now, then stopped suddenly, as if everyone had remembered they were being watched. Marcus opened his eyes as Sergeant Whitaker appeared at the end of the hallway, pale and sweating, with Officer Blake behind him, looking like a man who had just seen the ground disappear beneath his feet. The lock turned. The cell door opened. Marcus stood slowly, smoothing the front of his damp old hoodie, as if he were stepping onto the bench instead of out of a holding cell. He looked past Whitaker, past Reed, and directly at Blake. And for the first time that morning, Officer Travis Blake had nothing to say. Marcus stepped out of the holding cell with the same quiet control he carried into every courtroom. His wrists were marked from the cuffs, his hoodie was damp from the broken sprinkler, and a streak of dried mud clung to one leg of his sweatpants. Yet somehow, In that narrow hallway under the pale station lights, he looked less like a prisoner being released and more like the only person in the building who fully understood what had just begun. Sergeant Whitaker tried to speak first, but his voice caught in his throat. Officer Travis Blake stood behind him, eyes wide, jaw tight, the color gone from his face. Just a short time earlier, Blake had been loud, certain, and pleased with himself. Now he looked at Marcus like a man watching a storm cloud form over his own roof. A federal marshal stepped forward, broad-shouldered and calm, his badge hanging from a chain over his dark suit. He did not rush. He did not raise his voice. He simply looked at Marcus and said, "Judge Ellington, are you injured?" The words moved through the hallway like a cold wind. Judge Ellington. Every officer within hearing distance seemed to understand at the same moment that this was no longer a local mistake that could be softened in a report or buried under a few careful phrases. Marcus looked down at his wrists, then back at the marshal. "My shoulder hurts. My wrists are bruised, but I am able to stand." The marshal's face did not change, but his eyes hardened. A woman from the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division stepped beside him with a folder in one hand and a small recorder in the other. She introduced herself as Special Agent Renee Caldwell and told Marcus that the precinct was now under federal evidence preservation order. Blake suddenly found his voice. It came out rough and small. "Judge, listen, I didn't know who you were." Marcus turned his head slowly. The hallway went completely still. Even the phones out in the booking area seemed quieter. Marcus looked at Blake for a long moment before speaking. "That is not the problem, Officer Blake." His voice was soft, but it carried down the hallway with painful clarity. "The problem is that you believed not knowing who I was gave you permission to treat me any way you wanted." Blake opened his mouth, then closed it. Marcus stepped closer, not enough to threaten him, only enough to make him feel the weight of the words. "You did not make a mistake because I am a judge. You made a mistake because you saw a black man in front of a house and decided the truth did not matter." No one moved. Officer Reed stood near the wall, his face tense with guilt and fear. He had warned Blake. He had tried to slow him down, but trying was not the same as stopping. Marcus looked at him too, and Reed lowered his eyes. The marshal gently guided Marcus toward a chair in the booking area, where a medic began checking his wrists and shoulder. While that happened, the station changed around him. Agents collected body camera units. A technician moved toward the server room. Another investigator took command of the dispatch logs. Every door that had once seemed normal now felt like it was hiding something. Every officer who had laughed at Blake's story suddenly remembered another place they needed to be. Sergeant Whitaker tried to regain control. "Agent, I'm sure we can provide whatever you need through proper channels." Special Agent Caldwell looked at him with a calm that was almost kind, which somehow made it worse. "Sergeant, the proper channels arrived when your officer placed a sitting federal judge in a holding cell after taking him from his own driveway. You will step away from that computer." Whitaker's face tightened. He did not step away fast enough. One of the marshals moved beside him, and Whitaker suddenly remembered how to follow directions. Across the room, Blake watched as his body camera was removed from his vest and placed into an evidence bag. He looked at the bag, then at Whitaker, searching for rescue. Whitaker did not meet his eyes. Within minutes, the truth began rising like smoke from under a closed door. The dash camera showed Marcus standing calmly beside his sprinkler. Blake's body camera captured Marcus giving his name, offering to retrieve identification, and asking dispatch to verify the address. It captured Reed warning Blake to slow down. It captured Blake grabbing Marcus before any crime had been named, before any witness had complained, before any fact had been checked. It captured the shove into the cruiser. It captured the ride to the station, including Blake's muttered comments about people needing to learn where they belonged. By the time the first federal technician finished copying the footage, nobody in the room was pretending this was a misunderstanding anymore. But the video was only the first door. Once the Department of Justice opened it, the hallway behind it seemed endless. Special Agent Caldwell's team requested every arrest Blake had made in affluent neighborhoods over the past several years. They asked for complaints. They asked for use of force reports. They asked for body camera files that had been labeled damaged, missing, or accidentally deleted. Whitaker's hands grew restless each time a new request was made. He rubbed his thumb against his palm. He checked the room. He swallowed too often. Marcus watched him from the chair near the booking desk, saying little, noticing everything. By evening, the precinct was no longer functioning as a police station. It had become a federal investigation site. Officers were separated for interviews. Computers were copied. File cabinets were sealed. Reed gave a full statement before the sun went down. His voice shook, but he told the truth. He admitted Blake had no real reason to stop Marcus. He admitted Blake had ignored his warning. He admitted that other officers had known Blake pushed things too far, and that most people simply stayed quiet because they did not want trouble. When Agent Caldwell asked him why he had not physically stopped Blake, Reed stared at the table for a long time. Then he said, "Because I got used to surviving the job instead of doing it right." Those words stayed with Marcus after he was finally taken home. His wife, Alina, met him at the front door before the marshal could even knock. She had been calm on the phone, because panic would not help. But the moment she saw the bruises on his wrists, her face changed. She touched his hand gently, as if afraid the pain might travel. Their children stood behind her, silent and wide-eyed. Marcus wanted to tell them everything was fine, but he had never believed in lying to children just because the truth was heavy. So he knelt, even though his shoulder ached, and told them he was home, he was safe, and some people were now going to have to answer for what they had done. The next morning, Briar Glen Estates looked the same on the outside. Sprinklers whispered across perfect lawns. Dog walkers moved under the oak trees. Coffee machines hummed behind expensive windows. But the neighborhood had changed. People had seen the patrol car. They had seen Marcus pushed into the back seat. Some had recorded from behind curtains. Some had done nothing. A few came by with soft apologies and nervous faces. Marcus accepted their words with grace, but he noticed how many apologies began with, "I didn't know." He had heard that before. Blake did not know he was a judge. Neighbors did not know what to do. The department did not know it would become federal. So much harm in the world hid behind those 3 words. The investigation widened quickly. What began in Marcus's driveway became a map of old damage spread across counties and years. There was a black doctor stopped outside a gated community after visiting a patient, searched without cause, and accused of carrying stolen pills. There was a retired school principal pulled over 3 times in 1 month because Blake claimed her car matched vague burglary alerts. There was a young engineer detained in front of his own townhouse while neighbors watched, his laptop seized, and later returned with no apology. There was cash taken from a barber who had saved for a family vacation, written into a report as suspected drug money, though no drugs were ever found. Each story was different. Each story had the same shape. And behind many of those stories was Sergeant Whitaker. He had signed off on reports that did not match the video. He had moved complaints into inactive folders. He had approved body camera exceptions that made no sense. Sometimes he had called victims personally and warned them that filing formal complaints could make their lives difficult. He had not always been the loudest man in the room. He had not always thrown the cuffs on, but he had built the quiet shelter that allowed Blake to keep going. In the eyes of the law, that shelter began to look less like laziness and more like a wall. Blake tried many stories before choosing the one he thought might save him. First, he said Marcus had acted suspicious. Then he said the neighborhood had been under a burglary alert. Then he said Marcus had reached for the wrench in a threatening way. Then he said he could not remember exactly because the situation had been tense. But every new version met the same cold wall of footage, dispatch records, and witness statements. The sprinkler was broken. Marcus had given his name. No burglary call had come from that address. The wrench had been on the ground when Blake grabbed him. Reed had told him to check first. The truth did not need to shout. It simply stood there and refused to move. When federal agents arrested Travis Blake, they did it at the precinct, not in the parking lot, not quietly at home, not with a gentle phone call through his attorney. They came through the front doors while officers stood frozen near their desks. Blake had arrived that morning in uniform, still hoping his union lawyer could turn the case into a policy violation and not a crime. He was talking to Whitaker in a low voice when Agent Caldwell entered with 2 marshals behind her. She read the warrant in a steady tone. Civil rights violations under color of law, obstruction, false statements, theft connected to unlawful seizures, pattern of discriminatory enforcement. Blake looked around as if someone might step in, as if the badge on his chest still had magic in it. No one moved. One marshal turned him gently but firmly toward the wall. The handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists. For the first time in his career, Travis Blake felt cold metal close on him while everyone watched. Whitaker was arrested the same afternoon. He did not rage. He did not argue much. He only looked tired, as if the burden he had carried for years had finally become visible and too heavy to hold. As he was led away, he passed Marcus, who had returned to the precinct to provide a supplemental statement. Whitaker paused, eyes lowered. "Judge Ellington," he said quietly. "I should have stopped him sooner." Marcus studied him for a moment. "Yes," he said, "you should have. There was no cruelty in it." That made it harder for Whitaker to hear. The trial came months later, in a federal courthouse, where Marcus had spent years wearing the robe. This time, he entered through a different door. He came not as the judge, not as the man in control of the room, but as a witness. The courtroom was full. Reporters lined the benches. Former victims sat together in quiet rows, some holding hands, some staring straight ahead. Blake sat at the defense table in a dark suit that did not fit him as well as his uniform once had. Without the badge, he seemed smaller. Without the belt, the radio, the gun, and the cruiser waiting outside, he looked like a man who had mistaken borrowed power for his own strength. Marcus testified without anger. That was what unsettled people most. He did not raise his voice. He did not perform pain for the cameras. He described the morning plainly, from the broken sprinkler to the order to step away from his own house, from the handcuffs in the driveway to the moment Blake learned who he was. When the prosecutor asked what he felt when Blake said he did not know Marcus was a judge, Marcus paused. The whole room seemed to lean toward him. "I felt," Marcus said, "that he still did not understand what he had done. My title did not give me the right to be treated like a person. I already had that right." Other witnesses followed: the doctor, the principal, the engineer, the barber, a mother whose teenage son had been thrown against a car because Blake claimed he looked like someone who had run from a shoplifting call. Each voice added another stone to the foundation. Some cried. Some spoke with quiet fury. Some seemed relieved simply to be believed in a room where the record mattered. Reed testified too. He admitted his failure, and his honesty cost him friends inside the department, but it also helped tear down the lie that Blake had acted alone in one strange moment of confusion. The jury did not take long. When they returned, the courtroom was so silent that the paper in the clerk's hand sounded loud. "Guilty, guilty, guilty." The words came one after another, each one landing on Blake like a door closing. His shoulders sagged. His lawyer placed a hand on his arm, but Blake did not seem to feel it. Whitaker, who had taken a plea and testified about the cover-ups, later received prison time as well. The judge at sentencing spoke plainly. A badge was not a shield for fear. A uniform was not permission to invent guilt. Public trust was not a private weapon. Blake was sentenced to decades in federal prison, long enough that the life he had known ended in that courtroom. The department did not escape either. Federal oversight came down hard and stayed there. Policies were rewritten, supervisors were replaced, old complaints were reopened. Body camera rules were tightened until excuses had no room to breathe. Officers who had built careers on silence discovered that silence could now cost them everything. Some left, some changed, some were forced out before they could choose. The precinct that had once swallowed complaints like stones was made to speak, record, and answer. Through it all, Marcus returned to work. He still put on the robe. He still listened more than he spoke. He still corrected lawyers who tried to turn emotion into evidence, and evidence into fog. But something in him had shifted. Not broken, not hardened, just clarified. He had always known the law could be both promise and weapon. Now he had felt, in his own driveway, how quickly a person could be pushed from citizen to suspect by nothing more than another man's assumption. That knowledge did not make him bitter. It made him even more careful. Every ruling mattered, every record mattered. Every person standing before the court carried a story the powerful might prefer not to hear. One morning, almost a year later, Marcus stepped outside before breakfast. The air was cool, and the sun had just begun to warm the roof lines of Briar Glen Estates. The sprinkler near the driveway worked perfectly now, sending a soft silver arc across the grass. He stood there for a while in a clean hoodie and old sneakers, holding a garden hose in one hand, watching water darken the roots of a young magnolia tree Alina had planted after the trial ended. She said the yard needed something new. Marcus had not argued. A patrol car came slowly around the curve. For a moment, the sound of the engine pulled the old morning back into his body. The cuffs, the cruiser door, Blake's voice, the cold bench in the holding cell. Marcus stood still and watched. The new officer behind the wheel slowed near the driveway, lowered his window, and gave a respectful nod. "Good morning, Judge Ellington," the officer said. Marcus nodded back. "Good morning, officer." The cruiser continued down the street without stopping. No spotlight, no command, no hand on a weapon, just a patrol car passing through a quiet neighborhood where a man was watering his lawn. Marcus watched it disappear beneath the oak trees. He knew better than to believe one case could heal everything. Systems did not become fair simply because one guilty man was punished. But one door had opened. One pattern had been dragged into daylight. One department had been forced to face the people it had tried to ignore. And one officer who thought power made him untouchable had learned, far too late, that justice does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes dressed in old sweatpants, standing beside a broken sprinkler, waiting calmly for the truth to catch up. If this story made you think about power, dignity, and the quiet strength it takes to stand firm when someone tries to erase your rights, remember Marcus Ellington's morning. He did not win because he shouted the loudest. He won because the truth was on his side, and because every lie eventually had to meet the record. In the end, the badge that Travis Blake used to frighten others could not protect him from the law he had forgotten to respect. Justice reached the driveway, walked into the precinct, entered the courtroom, and finally found the man who thought he could never be touched.